everyone, it's Leanne. Welcome to another video on my channel. Today I have a watercolor card to share with you. I created a Pokemon card for my nephew Lucas, and so I'm just going to go through that process. So to begin, I sketched out Pikachu on mixed media paper. I'm going to use this with watercolor, but mixed media paper sort of behaves differently with watercolor and it makes the colors more saturated. I really like the effect, so that's why I chose this medium. And so I'm going to ink my pencil lines first with my Micron pens. These are waterproof and archival ink. So I really like using these pens. They're beautiful and they give a really nice rich black color. So I'm using I think it's an 05. I brought in an 03, but I found that I liked the thicker lines. In fact, I even went over some of my lines and added accent thicknesses. Keeping most of the thicknesses to the left side of the critter. I guess you could call Pikachu a critter. And yeah, so I mostly used my 05 and then I came in at the end with my 08 as well, just to do some touch-ups with that. So I actually really like inking lines. I know that sounds kind of silly and some people probably find this process part monotonous, but I find it very soothing to just ink something because the drawing's already down on the paper and you know what you need to do. You don't have to think about it. And so it's nice just to let your mind wander and just kind of enjoy the process, I guess. And I also did my own lettering by hand, which is always nerve-wracking. I'm a graphic designer and I should be good at that, but I always worry that I'm going to make a line a little crooked or blot it with ink a little too much or something, but I thought it turned out okay. So the sentiment I chose is, I choose you, Lukachu. I guess in Pokemon they say, I choose you, Pikachu. And so when my nephew opened up this card and seen that it had his name on it, he was so excited. And that reaction was just priceless. So I was so happy that I did this for him. So now I have it all inked and I let it dry. And it's really important to let it dry or it'll smudge. But once it's dry, it's waterproof. So I'm going to come in with my Grumbacher brush, my watercolor brush. I picked this up at Michael's. It's an 08 or an 8 round. I also have a 4 round that I use for smaller details. I was deciding whether I wanted to use my watercolor brush or some of my water brushes that have water in the barrel and you don't have to dip them in water. But I honestly feel like I have more control with a regular brush. I can control the flow of water easier, and I find it's easier to watercolor with that way. So that's what I went with. Although sometimes using water brushes when you're out in the field, like if you're doing plein air watercoloring, for instance, on location, it's much easier to travel with brushes that have water inside the barrel. So anyways, I'm starting by coloring my Pikachu yellow, and this is lemon yellow hue. It's the brightest, richest yellow in my palette, and I love this color. And so the other thing with mixed media paper is it does hold the water as well. It's not as absorbent as watercolor paper, so you have more time to work with the colors. And the beautiful thing about watercolor is you can layer colors and they react together and create different gradients and blends, and I love that effect. So it gave me lots of time to work with it. So while the yellow here is still wet, I'm coming in with a touch of, I believe this is cad red hue and cadmium yellow hue. And so I'm just thinking about where my shadows would be for him. I'm going to put them on the right side, the bottom right side. And then anywhere there's creases or overlap, and just kind of highlighting those shadows with this darker yellow. And then because that base color that I put down is still wet, it will blend together. And here I'm just blurring at the edges a little bit more. And so when it's dry, it'll look like a nice gradient, like I did it with, sort of like with Distress inks or something, or Copic markers. Not a perfect gradient, but a fun watercolory gradient. So now the trick to watercoloring is just practice, practice, practice. It's sort of a new medium to me, but I've been studying it probably since the winter time, so I guess that's probably 6 or 8 months, I guess. And I couldn't get it for the longest time, and then something someday just clicked in my brain, and it was like, oh, I know how I need to do this. And it is really just controlling the flow of water, not too much water, but not being too dry either. And then I find if you put on too much of something, just take water out of your brush and it'll lift up some water for you. Or if you need to blend, make sure you have a damp brush that's consistent with the dampness of your paper, and then they'll work together. One won't lift the other. Which that probably sounds a little hard to understand, but the more you work with it, the more you will see that that makes sense. So I'm just coming in and blurring my little shadow lines again with some of that yellow, that lemon yellow hue, just to help soften those edges and kind of work them into each other to get more of that gradient, that transition color. And so then for the cheeks, I used permanent rose for the cheeks and the mouth, which I will bring in here shortly. I didn't need a lot of colors to create this card overall, which was really fun. So for the background here, I'm using a combination of phthalo blue, and I'm laying that down as my base. So my first just light wash of phthalo blue, there's more water in my ink than a pigment. And just making sure I cover the background once and make the paper damp so that I can start to blend the colors together and drop them in and let them sort of bleed out into the other colors. So the two colors I will use for this background is phthalo blue, which is the background base, and then I'm coming in with Viridian hue as well. Viridian hue is like an emerald green. It is a beautiful color. And surprisingly, that color mixes really nicely with any of the blues, the phthalo blue or the ultramarine blue, and it gives this kind of emeraldy greenish blue. It's just a rich, beautiful color. I think it's my favorite color combination right now. So as I have the background wet, I'm coming in with a little bit of phthalo blue, and then I'm going to add little droplets or little stipples of Viridian hue, and that's the darker color you see there. So I'm just letting that sort of mingle around in the wet ink and just kind of letting it do its thing. It takes, you can leave watercolor for a minute or so, and the result will change drastically within that minute. It will blend together more and create these beautiful, lush, kind of organic gradients that aren't perfect smooth gradients, but they blend beautifully. So here I'm finishing off the cheeks and the mouth, and I'm using permanent rose with a touch of alizarin crimson hue just for the shadows. So that part's super easy. And as I mentioned, you don't need a lot of colors for this card. It was super easy to make, and it painted up really quick, and I had a lot of fun. And it was kind of like once I got to the end, it was sort of hard to believe that it was done because I had so much fun doing it, and it went so quickly. So here I'm just adding some more of the phthalo blue, just making the background a little bit richer, a little bit darker. I want to keep around the sentiment light and then accentuate the background outside of that sentiment. Because the sentiment's black, I want a light background to support it. So I'm coming in here with a damp brush. I don't have any pigment on my brush, but I'm just blending out where that sentiment is, trying to lift a bit of that ink, that watercolor pigment. So with my damp brush, I'm reactivating that watercolor that's on that base, and then as I wipe my brush off on my paper towel, I'm just wiping off any pigment I picked up. So that's super handy to do as well. Watercolor is great in that regard. You can, as long as it's not a staining color, you can lift it up with ease, and so that made that area lighter. And so I want the parts around Pikachu in the background to be darker, just to give him a little more oomph and bring him up as a foreground element. So I have him all ready, and he has dried. I put him aside to dry for a few minutes. And now I'm coming in with my tape roller on my card base, and I did this at A2 card size, just because it's a standard size. And I have envelopes that fit it as well, so it was pretty good. Now, because my mixed media paper curled when it was painted because it got wet, I wanted to line it up evenly with my hands there. And I also lined up the folded edge first because it's easier to trim off those edges, but you can't trim the folded line or you would cut your card up. So that's a good tip to remember. And then at the end, I'm just coming in with my micron pen. Anywhere that watercolor went over the lines and it dulled it a little bit, I'm just adding a bit more pigment on top with my micron pen to make those black lines really stand out and pop. So I have my card ready, and this is the end result. My nephew loved his card, and I was super excited to give it to him. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It's a little different. If you did, be sure to give it a like and subscribe so you're notified the next time I post a video. Thank you so much for watching.